January 17, 1942. The South China Sea. The water was black glass under a moonless sky. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka stood on the bridge of the merchant vessel Ryujo Maru, a 7,000-ton freighter laden with Malayan rubber, Sumatran oil, and Philippine copper, the sinews of empire. The ship cut through calm waters at 12 knots, part of a convoy shepherding the lifeblood of Japan's war machine back to the home islands. Tanaka could taste salt on his lips, could hear the rhythmic thrum of the diesel engines below deck. He felt safe. The American fleet lay broken at Pearl Harbor. The Philippines were falling. Singapore would be next. The Pacific, for the first time in centuries, was becoming a Japanese lake. Then the night erupted. A column of white water shot skyward amidships, the explosion's percussion waves slamming Tanaka against the bridge rail. The Ryujo Maru shuddered, metal screaming as the torpedo's detonation tore through her hull plating. Within seconds, seawater was flooding the cargo holds. Within minutes, the ship was listing 15 degrees to port. Tanaka never saw the attacker. He never heard the approach. One moment there was peace and the promise of Tokyo Harbor. The next there was chaos and the certainty of drowning. Somewhere beneath those black waters, an American submarine was already slipping away, its crew marking another kill on the boat's conning tower. This was not supposed to happen. Not here, not now, not to an empire that had just reached the zenith of its power. In December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft turned Pearl Harbor into an inferno, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood as the third-largest maritime force on Earth. But naval might is measured not just in battleships and carriers, it is measured in logistics, in the unglamorous mathematics of fuel consumption and steel production, in the thousands of merchant vessels that transform raw materials into military power. Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia was never merely territorial ambition. It was existential necessity. The home islands possessed almost no petroleum, scant quantities of iron ore, negligible rubber production, and insufficient rice to feed their population. Everything the empire needed to sustain itself, let alone prosecute a war across the Pacific, had to be imported across thousands of miles of ocean. The architects of Japanese expansion understood this vulnerability with crystalline clarity. The Southern Resource Area, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Burma, contained everything Japan lacked. Oil fields that could produce 50 million barrels annually, tin mines, rubber plantations, rice paddies that stretched beyond horizon. Seize these territories, imperial planners calculated, and Japan could become self-sufficient. Create a defensive perimeter from the Aleutians to New Guinea. Fortify it with island bastions, and the Americans would never penetrate it. The merchant fleet, over 6 million tons of shipping at war's outbreak, would shuttle resources northward in an endless stream, feeding the factories of Osaka and Nagoya, the refineries of Yokohama, the naval yards of Kura. It was a vision of autarkic power, of an empire that could sustain itself indefinitely behind its oceanic moat. But it rested on a single assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong: that the sea lanes could be protected, that the Americans, with their surface fleet crippled at Pearl Harbor, could not threaten the maritime arteries connecting Tokyo to its southern conquests. That command of the seas meant command of the depths. Chonendikun. Japanese had forgotten to look down. The United States Navy entered Worlds War II with roughly 50 operational submarines in the Pacific Fleet. They were not impressive machines by the standards of what was to come. The older S-class boats were cramped, slow-diving relics from the previous war. The newer fleet submarines, the Gato and Tambor classes, were more capable but plagued with a catastrophic defect that would not be fully corrected until 1943. Their Mark 14 torpedoes were fundamentally unreliable, running too deep, failing to detonate, or prematurely exploding. In the war's first year, American submarine skippers returned from patrols with tales of perfect attacks that yielded nothing. Torpedoes that struck targets and bounced off, that ran beneath enemy hulls, that circled back toward their own boats. Yet even with defective weapons, even undermanned and undersupplied in the war's chaotic opening months, the American submarines began their work. They had one advantage that would prove decisive: geography. Every ton of rubber, every barrel of oil, every ingot of tin that Japan extracted from its southern conquests had to travel north through narrow choke points. The Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippines, the Makassar Strait in the East Indies, the waters south of Japan's home islands. These were not broad oceans where convoys could disperse and hide. They were maritime highways, and the American submarines began to line them with graves. The Japanese had not prepared for this kind of war. Their submarine doctrine emphasized attacks on enemy warships, carriers and battleships, the prestige targets that would decide fleet engagements. The idea of systematically targeting merchant shipping, of waging economic warfare against civilian supply lines, was considered ungentlemanly, a violation of the warrior ethos that animated Japanese naval culture. The Americans harbored no such qualms. On December 7, 1941, even as the smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark issued an order that would define the Pacific submarine campaign. Execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. Every merchant vessel, every tanker, every freighter was now a legitimate target. The gloves were off. Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore took USS Growler out of Pearl Harbor on her first war patrol in March 1942. He was 34 years old, a submariner who had spent a decade learning his craft in peacetime exercises and training runs. Nothing in those exercises had prepared him for what he found in the waters off Taiwan. Ships, everywhere. Tankers moving south in ballast to collect oil from Borneo. Freighters heading north heavy with raw materials. Troop transports shuttling soldiers to garrison newly conquered islands. The targets were so numerous that Gilmore's primary challenge was not finding enemy vessels, but choosing which ones to attack, rationing his torpedoes across multiple encounters. On the night of March 18th, Growler intercepted a convoy of 3 cargo ships escorted by a single destroyer. Gilmore maneuvered his boat into attack position, fired a spread of 4 torpedoes, and watched through the periscope as 2 ships erupted in flames. The destroyer immediately began pinging with active sonar, dropping depth charges in a widening pattern. Growler went deep, silent running, every man aboard frozen at his station as the destroyer's screws passed overhead. The depth charges detonated with hammer blows that buckled deck plates, shattered light bulbs, sent tools flying from their racks. But the ocean is vast and three-dimensional, and the destroyer guessed wrong about their depth. When the pinging faded, Gilmore brought Growler back to periscope depth. The 2 freighters were gone beneath the waves. The third was fleeing at maximum speed, its silhouette shrinking toward the horizon. In the water, dozens of Japanese sailors clung to debris, waiting for rescue that would not arrive before dawn. Gilmore wrote in his patrol report, "It is a strange feeling to watch men drown and know you put them there. But this is the war they started. This is the war we will finish." The patrol lasted 63 days. Growler sank 38,000 tons of Japanese shipping, 6 vessels in total, and returned to Pearl Harbor with 2 torpedoes remaining. Gilmore's crew was exhausted, bearded, stinking of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, their skin pale from 2 months without sunlight. But they had also discovered something the Japanese were only beginning to comprehend. The hunters had become the hunted. By mid-1942, reports were accumulating on the desks of Imperial Navy staff officers in Tokyo that painted an alarming picture. Merchant ship losses were running at 150,000 tons per month, double the rate Japanese shipyards could replace them. Convoys were being decimated in the narrow seas between the Philippines and Formosa. Tankers that left Borneo loaded with crude oil were vanishing before reaching Japan, their cargoes lost to the depths. The southern resource area was producing everything the planners had hoped: oil, rubber, metals, food. But the logistics network that was supposed to deliver those resources northward was hemorrhaging vessels at an unsustainable rate. Captain Atsushi Oi, one of the Navy's most respected staff officers, reviewed the numbers with growing dread. Japan had begun the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. In the first 8 months of conflict, they had lost 600,000 tons, 10% of the fleet. At this rate, the entire merchant marine would be gone within 5 years. And the Americans, Oi noted in his reports, were building submarines at an accelerating pace. The shipyards at Groton, Connecticut, and Mare Island, California, were launching a new fleet submarine every month. Each one carried 24 torpedoes. Each one could range across the Pacific for 70 days without refueling. Each one represented another predator prowling Japan's sea lanes. Oi recommended immediate implementation of a convoy system, grouping merchant vessels together with destroyer escorts, creating anti-submarine warfare training programs, developing depth charges and sonar equipment optimized for submarine hunting. His proposals were acknowledged and filed away. The Imperial Navy's attention remained focused on the glamorous battles at Coral Sea and Midway, on carrier versus carrier clashes that would decide control of the Pacific. Protecting merchant shipping seemed prosaic by comparison, unglamorous work better suited for secondary vessels and reserve officers. The submarines could be dealt with later, after the American fleet was crushed in decisive battle. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Americans were not coming for a decisive battle. They were coming for Japan's throat, one merchant ship at a time. In the summer of 1942, the tide of the Pacific War reached high water for Japan and began its slow, inexorable retreat. The invasion of Midway ended in catastrophe, 4 carriers lost in a single day. Guadalcanal became a months-long meat grinder that consumed thousands of Japanese soldiers and scores of warships. The defensive perimeter that was supposed to protect the empire began to contract under relentless American pressure. And beneath the waves, the submarine campaign intensified into a systematic strangling of Japan's maritime supply lines. The Americans had finally fixed their torpedoes. By late 1943, the Mark 14's depth-keeping problems had been corrected, its magnetic detonators replaced with reliable contact exploders. The weapons that had betrayed submarine skippers for 2 years now worked as designed, and the results were devastating. American submarines ranged across the western Pacific with near impunity, penetrating the Sea of Japan itself, lurking off Tokyo Bay, transforming every Japanese port into a killing ground. Japanese merchant captains began their voyages knowing the odds were increasingly against them. Would this convoy make it through the Luzon Strait? Would the tanker reach Yokohama before a torpedo found its engine room? Commander Richard O'Kane took USS Tang on 5 war patrols between January 1944 and October 1944. He was a perfectionist, a skipper who drilled his crew relentlessly in attack procedures until they could fire a spread of 6 torpedoes in less than a minute. He was also utterly ruthless. O'Kane hunted Japanese shipping with the focused intensity of a mathematician solving an equation. Calculate the target's course and speed, position the submarine to minimize its profile, fire torpedoes in a spread pattern that would account for evasive maneuvers, then go deep before the escorts could react. On Tang's 3rd patrol, O'Kane sank 10 ships in a single voyage. Tankers, freighters, and troop transports totaling over 39,000 tons. On the 4th patrol, he took Tang into the Formosa Strait and devastated a convoy carrying reinforcements to the Philippines, sending 13,000 tons to the bottom in one night's action. The Japanese could not comprehend how the Americans were achieving such success. Intelligence reports spoke of submarines appearing in supposedly secure waters, attacking with precision, then vanishing before counterattacks could be organized. The American boats seemed to know exactly where convoys would be, what routes they would take, what time they would pass through vulnerable choke points. In fact, they did know. American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese merchant shipping codes, could read convoy routing orders almost as quickly as Japanese port authorities issued them. Every planned voyage, every ship movement, every tanker departure from Balikpapan or Tarakan was known to the submarine command at Pearl Harbor. The intelligence was distributed to submarine skippers at sea via encrypted radio transmissions, guiding them to their targets with near-perfect accuracy. It was slaughter made systematic, killing transformed into logistics. By 1944, the nature of life in the Japanese merchant marine had fundamentally changed. Merchant sailors, once considered civilians performing essential but unglamorous labor, now had casualty rates approaching those of frontline infantry. More than 60,000 Japanese merchant seamen would die during the war, a mortality rate exceeding 30%, higher than any branch of the imperial military, except perhaps the kamikaze corps. Captains made night passages through dangerous waters with their ships running dark, hoping to evade detection. Oil tankers sailed from the East Indies with half-loads, calculating that lighter ships could make better speed and had a fractionally higher chance of surviving the voyage. Food shipments from Southeast Asia grew increasingly sporadic, contributing to the malnutrition that was beginning to afflict the civilian population of the home islands. The strategic implications cascaded through every dimension of Japan's war effort. Aircraft production declined as aluminum shipments from Southeast Asia were disrupted. The combined fleet's battleships and carriers remained in port for longer periods, conserving fuel because tankers were being sunk faster than refineries could replace their cargoes. Army units in the Pacific Islands went hungry as supply ships vanished en route, forcing garrisons to subsist on whatever local resources they could scavenge. The great industrial machine that was supposed to outproduce the Western powers began to sputter and stall. Starved of raw materials by submarines that never appeared in victory parades or propaganda newsreels, Captain Toshikazu Omai, a senior staff officer in Tokyo, compiled a report in late 1944 that painted the situation in bleak terms. Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to 2.7 million tons, less than half its size at war's outbreak. Losses in 1944 alone exceeded 3.5 million tons, a rate of destruction that would eliminate the remaining merchant marine within 6 months. Shipyards were building new vessels as fast as they could, but American submarines were sinking ships far faster than they could be replaced. The mathematics, Omai noted, were irreversible. Japan was being defeated not by aircraft carriers or battleships, not by amphibious invasions or strategic bombing, but by the slow strangulation of its oceanic supply routes. The report was marked Most Secret and circulated among senior leadership. Its recommendations, immediate negotiation of peace terms, redeployment of all available destroyers to convoy escort duty, abandonment of outlying island garrisons to concentrate resources, were never implemented. The war ground onward toward its inevitable conclusion. There was a particular irony that haunted Japanese naval officers who understood what was happening. Before the war, Japan had been the world's third-largest maritime power, its merchant fleet crisscrossing the Pacific and Indian Oceans in peaceful trade. Japanese shipbuilding technology was among the most advanced on Earth. The nation's naval architects had designed submarines that could travel 20,000 miles without refueling, aircraft-carrying submarines that could launch bombing raids against the American mainland, Kaiten human torpedoes that represented the ultimate expression of suicidal determination. All of this ingenuity, all of this industrial capability, and yet Japan never developed an effective counter to the American submarine campaign. The reasons were partly technological. Japanese sonar was inferior to American equipment, making underwater detection more difficult. Depth charges were less powerful and less sophisticated than those used by British and American forces. Japan never developed an equivalent to the Hedgehog or Squid mortars that Allied navies employed to attack submarines ahead of attacking ships rather than astern. But the failures were also doctrinal and cultural. Anti-submarine warfare was unglamorous work, defensive rather than offensive, patient rather than aggressive. It did not align with the Bushido ethos of decisive attack, of seeking the enemy and destroying him in honorable combat. Hunting submarines required methodical persistence, teams of escort vessels working in coordinated patterns, willingness to accept that success meant nothing happened. The convoy arrived safely because the submarine was deterred or destroyed before it could attack. The Japanese Navy never fully committed to this kind of warfare. Destroyers that could have escorted convoys were instead deployed to fleet operations or to resupply isolated island garrisons in high-speed Tokyo Express runs. Anti-submarine training programs remained underdeveloped throughout the war. Convoy organization was haphazard, often organizing ships by destination rather than by speed, resulting in slow vessels delaying entire groups and creating easier targets. When submarines attacked, escort vessels would drop a few depth charges and then resume their course rather than prosecuting sustained attacks that might actually destroy the submarine. American submarine skippers learned that if they went deep and stayed quiet for 30 minutes after an attack, the escorts would usually give up and depart. This was not cowardice or incompetence. It was the product of a military culture that had never conceptualized maritime logistics as the center of gravity in the Pacific War. The Imperial Japanese Navy prepared to fight and die in spectacular carrier battles and night surface actions. They did not prepare for the unglamorous work of protecting tankers and freighters, and so the tankers and freighters died, and with them died the empire. In October 1944, Commander Richard O'Kane and USS Tang departed for their fifth war patrol, heading for the Formosa Strait, the narrow waters between Taiwan and mainland China that served as a critical transit route for ships moving between Japan and Southeast Asia. Tang had become one of the most successful submarines in the American fleet, credited with sinking 24 enemy vessels totaling over 93,000 tons. O'Kane's crew were veterans now, men who had survived depth charge attacks and torpedo runs, who knew the sounds of metal tearing and men drowning. On the night of October 24th, Tang intercepted a convoy of transports carrying Japanese troops and supplies southward. O'Kane maneuvered into attack position and began firing torpedoes in rapid succession, hitting 2 transports in quick succession. As the convoy scattered and escorts began counterattacking, Tang fired her last 2 torpedoes at a fleeing transport. One torpedo ran true. The other malfunctioned, its steering mechanism jamming, causing it to circle back toward Tang. O'Kane realized what was happening and ordered emergency speed, trying to outrun his own weapon. The torpedo struck Tang in the stern, the explosion tearing through the after-engine room and after-torpedo room. Tang went down in 180 feet of water. 78 men were aboard. 9, including O'Kane, survived the sinking and were taken prisoner by Japanese forces. The others died in the flooded compartments or drowned attempting to escape. The Imperial Navy never knew that Tang had been destroyed by her own weapon. Their records credited a destroyer escort with the kill, reporting that depth charges had destroyed an American submarine after a prolonged hunt. It was a small victory to celebrate amid unrelenting catastrophe. By the beginning of 1945, Japan's maritime lifeline had been severed. The merchant fleet was reduced to fewer than 2 million tons, and most of those vessels remained in port, their captains unwilling to risk voyages across waters that had become killing grounds. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, which had reached 20 million barrels in 1943, declined to 10 million in 1944 and virtually ceased in 1945. The combined fleets, surviving battleships and carriers, lay at anchor, immobilized by lack of fuel. Aluminum production for aircraft construction fell by 70% as bauxite shipments stopped. Food imports from Southeast Asia dwindled to nothing, forcing Japan to rely entirely on domestic rice production that was insufficient to feed the population. The American submarines had accomplished what the battleships at Midway, the carriers at the Philippine Sea, and the B-29s over Tokyo could not. They had brought the Japanese war machine to a grinding halt by cutting its supply of raw materials. The strategic vision that had driven Japan's southward expansion, secure the resources, transport them to the home islands, convert them into military power, had been shattered by submarines that appeared without warning, struck without mercy, and vanished into the depths. In March 1945, Captain Atsushi Oi, the staff officer who had warned of the submarine threat in 1942, compiled a final report on the merchant marine's destruction. The numbers were staggering. Japan had lost 8.9 million tons of merchant shipping during the war, far more than the total tonnage that existed at the war's beginning, because the figure included newly constructed vessels that were sunk before they could complete even a single voyage. Of those losses, 4.9 million tons, 55%, had been destroyed by submarines. American aircraft, both carrier-based and land-based, accounted for another 2.6 million tons. Mines, surface warships, and accidents made up the remainder. But the submarines were the primary killers, the predators that had turned the Pacific into a graveyard. Wai's report ended with a single devastating sentence. Japan's defeat was inevitable from the moment we could no longer protect our sea lanes. There is a recording that survives from September 1945, made aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay during the surrender ceremony. The sound quality is poor, degraded by decades of storage and transfer between formats. But if you listen carefully, past the static and the scratching, you can hear Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz speaking about the Allied victory. He mentions the carrier battles at Coral Sea and Midway, praises the Marines who fought at Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, commends the airmen who bombed Japan's cities. Then he pauses, and when he resumes speaking, his tone shifts to something quieter, more reflective. But the silent service, Nimitz says, referring to the submarine force, strangled the enemy. Without ever firing a shot that the world could hear, they won a war of attrition that made every other victory possible. 52. American submarines were lost during the Pacific War. 3,505 submariners died, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military, 22% of all men who served in the submarine force. They sank 1,814 Japanese vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 carriers, 11 cruisers, and over 5 million tons of merchant shipping. They rescued downed aviators, conducted reconnaissance missions, landed commandos on enemy beaches, and severed the arteries that connected Japan's empire to its conquests. The Japanese officers who survived the war and later wrote their memoirs struggled to articulate what the submarine campaign had felt like from their perspective. How do you describe the psychological effect of an enemy you almost never see? How do you explain to peacetime audiences the cumulative impact of ships that simply never arrive, of resources that vanish beneath the waves, of an entire strategic concept unraveling because merchant sailors are dying faster than they can be replaced? Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, who captained the submarine that sank USS Indianapolis in the war's final days, wrote in his post-war account, "The Americans understood something we did not. They understood that modern war is not won by brave men dying gloriously. It is won by patient men killing efficiently. Their submarines were not warriors in the sense that we understood the term. They were executioners, carrying out a systematic destruction of our ability to wage war. We could not comprehend it because we did not want to comprehend it. to admit that the war would be decided not on the battlefield but in the silent depths, not by heroism but by mathematics. This was unbearable to contemplate. There is a museum in Kure, Japan, on the site of the old naval arsenal where the battleship Yamato was constructed. Inside, among the exhibits documenting Imperial Navy history, there is a small display case containing an object that most visitors walk past without noticing. It is a ship's compass, bronze and green with age, recovered from the wreck of a merchant vessel sunk by an American submarine in 1944. The placard beside it notes simply, "From the Osama Maru, lost in the South China Sea. All hands. The compass is frozen, its needle pointing north, the direction the ship was heading when the torpedo struck, the direction that would have taken it home to Japan. It sits in that case pointing north still, a small brass reminder of the thousands of vessels that set out in that direction and never arrived. Behind the glory of the carrier battles, behind the drama of the island campaigns, behind the apocalyptic destruction of the atomic bombs, there was this, the unglamorous mathematics of tonnage sunk versus tonnage replaced, of raw materials required versus raw materials delivered, of miles traveled across hostile oceans where death could arrive without warning from the black depths below. The American submarines won no territory. They liberated no concentration camps. Their victories never featured in propaganda newsreels showing triumphant flag raisings or enemy surrenders. But they accomplished something more fundamental than any of those achievements. They proved that modern industrial warfare is won not by the side with the bravest soldiers or the most advanced technology, but by the side that can maintain its logistics chains under sustained attack. They demonstrated that you can conquer all the territory you want, seize all the resources you need. But if you cannot transport those resources to where they are required, conquest becomes meaningless. Japan's empire stretched from the borders of India to the approaches of Australia, from the Aleutian Islands to the jungles of New Guinea. It was vast beyond the dreams of earlier Japanese expansionists, and it was hollow, because the roads that connected it, the sea lanes across the Pacific, had been cut by submarines that most Japanese citizens never even knew existed until after the war ended. This is the truth that Captain Tanaka, clinging to wreckage in the South China Sea in January 1942, could not have known as he watched the Ryujo Maru slide beneath the waves. This is the reality that imperial planners in Tokyo refused to acknowledge even as the evidence accumulated month after month. The Pacific War would be decided not by battleships or carriers, not by tanks or aircraft, but by submarines hunting merchant ships in the night. It would be won by patience rather than glory, by logistics rather than heroism, by the slow constriction of supply lines until an empire that had seemed invincible simply had nothing left with which to fight. The silent service, hunting in the depths, understood this from the beginning. They waged war not for honor or territory, but for tonnage and statistics, for the unglamorous arithmetic of replacement rates and cargo capacity. They killed because killing was efficient, because every ship sunk was one fewer vessel carrying oil to Japanese ports, rubber to Japanese factories, food to Japanese cities. They won because they recognized that wars between industrial nations are won by whichever side can sustain its industrial base longer, and they systematically destroyed Japan's ability to do so. In the end, the submarine campaign was the most American way to fight a war. Practical, industrial, focused on measurable results rather than symbolic victories. The submarines did not conquer Japan. They simply made it impossible for Japan to continue fighting. They strangled the empire, slowly and methodically, until even the most fanatical believers in ultimate victory could no longer deny that the mathematics had rendered the war unwinnable. This was not a defeat suffered in a climactic battle or a glorious last stand. It was a defeat inflicted through the accumulation of 10,000 small catastrophes, each one another ship failing to reach port, another tanker vanishing into the depths, Another compass frozen, pointing north toward a home it would never reach.